Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving right into the history and the absolute staggering scale behind the 30 million strong global Indian diaspora. It's a massive story of human movement, deep economic shifts, and literally reshaping the global map as we know it.
Okay, let's get right into it. We're going to take some pretty dense historical facts and translate them into a clear, easy-to-follow narrative. We'll be looking at the powerful, often highly coercive forces that drove millions of Indians to leave their homes, where they ended up, and exactly how these historical waves built the massive, vibrant communities we see around the world today. Here's our roadmap for today. First, ancient versus modern waves. Second, the sheer scale of emigration. Third, why did Indians leave? Fourth, the 5 patterns of migration. And finally, the indentured labor system. All right, section 1. Ancient versus modern waves. What's really fascinating here is the stark contrast between these two eras. Wave 1, the ancient wave, was super organic. You had small groups of traders moving across Asia, slowly blending in over centuries. But Wave 2, the modern wave, was heavily manufactured. You see, after slavery was abolished across the British Empire in 1834, colonial sugar plantations desperately needed cheap labor. And to fill that massive void, a highly engineered movement of people was kicked off from India to the colonies. Moving on to section 2, the scale of emigration. Get this, between 1834 and 1937, an estimated 30 million Indians emigrated. Just let that number sink in for a second. 30 million. However, the source data reveals this was essentially a massive revolving door of labor contracts. Because roughly 24 million eventually returned home, the net emigration for this specific period was actually about 6.25 million people. Still a massive number. To really put that historical weight into perspective, just look at the comparison of outmigration data. India's numbers, hovering near 28 million during this era, were the absolute highest of any single country. But even more staggeringly, our sources point out that this flow vastly exceeded the estimated 4.5 million African slave labor flow to the Americas spanning 3 entire centuries. We are literally looking at one of the largest coordinated movements of people in human history. So the key takeaway here? This wasn't some smooth, continuous wave of folks just freely looking for a fresh start. Not at all. It was a highly volatile system. The numbers skyrocketed and plummeted based on global events like the First World War and huge economic depressions. Which means, at the end of the day, uncertain labor contracts dictated exactly when and where human beings were shipped. Which brings us to section 3. Why did Indians leave in the first place? Our sources lay out a literal perfect storm of domestic pressures. Imagine this. Colonial land policies crank up taxes to a crushing 80 or 90%, creating a massive class of landless, desperate laborers. Add to that widespread famines, which incredibly were actively worsened by government food grain exports. At the exact same time, India's booming handicraft industry was intentionally dismantled by heavy British tariffs. So, with local industries wiped out and industrial growth kept artificially slow, massive unemployment and severe overdependence on farming just became the inescapable reality for millions. Jawaharlal Nehru actually hit the nail on the head when he described this grim historical reality. He emphasized how the deliberate destruction of local cottage industries, paired with that heavy taxation, basically forced the peasant into an inescapable iron grip of debt. According to the historical accounts, we aren't just talking about a tough economy. It was a systemic dismantling of people's livelihoods. Put simply, when your local village economy is completely collapsing and industrial growth is totally stalled, well, a distant plantation offering basic food, shelter, and a meager wage suddenly becomes your only real option for survival. The data strongly suggests people didn't leave because they were looking for adventure. They left because they literally had no other choice. All right, let's look at section 4, the 5 patterns of migration. The sources break this massive global migration down into 5 specific historical patterns. The first 3 are rooted right in the colonial era: indentured labor, Kangani labor, and free emigration. Then, fast forward to after India's independence, and we see a shift to 2 post-colonial patterns: the highly skilled brain drain moving to the west, and later the vast labor migration heading to the oil-rich countries of West Asia. And that leads us into our 5th and final section, the indentured labor system. It is absolutely crucial we understand what indenture actually meant on the ground. A laborer signed a contract binding them to an employer for 4 to 7 years. In exchange for the boat ride and basic upkeep, they worked for little to no cash.
But here is the stark reality. During this contract, they were legally bound. They could be sold, they could be traded, they even needed permission just to get married. Created as a direct replacement for slavery, the sources note it basically functioned as unfree labor in all but name. Now, looking at where this captive workforce actually ended up is fascinating. The numbers are huge. Hundreds of thousands sent off to Mauritius, Suriname, Guyana, Trinidad, and South Africa. This colonial spreadsheet effectively seeded distinct Indian communities across the West Indies, Africa, and the Pacific. And because many of these workers were offered a small plot of land instead of a return ticket home, these communities permanently settled and are still thriving in those regions today. Ultimately, sure, it might have looked like a standard work contract on paper, but the worker had basically zero bargaining power. And the freedom they finally earned at the end of those brutal years often just resulted in a small plot of dirt in a foreign colony they had never organically chosen to live in to begin with. I really hope this explainer gave you some solid context on these massive historical migrations. When you look at the incredibly vibrant 30 million strong global diaspora today, it's fascinating and, kind of sobering to realize so much of it was engineered by 19th century colonial economics. It really leaves you wondering how much of our global demographic map today, the borders and communities we just accept as normal, is still just a shadow of those old imperial spreadsheets. Definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me.